Hello guys and welcome back. So in the last video we created here our media player service connection. So we want to hook up the UI, and for this video we are just going to create our view model and connect everything. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, now let's navigate here to our UI. So inside here now we can just create a new package and we can just call this audio. And here basically now we can just create our audio view model. So you can come here and create our audio view model. Okay, so we want to pass in here several dependencies. So you can just create here, we can just inject this class and we can inject the constructor. And here what we want to pass in is the repository. So we can create a private val and call this repository. And we pass in here the audio repository. Also we want to pass in here the service connection. And we can easily pass that media service connection. And for that case here, we want to inherit this from a view model class. And also here we can annotate this with @health view model. Okay, so let's create here some variables which we want to use them. So the first thing here, we are just going to create our audio list. And here basically we can pass in the audio list. So this one is going to be observed by the composables. So that's why we are just using this mutable state list off so that we can pass in here to our composables. Okay, also we want to get the current playing audio. So we can just call this current playing audio. And here basically now we can just use our service connection and we can call here our current playing audio. And this is just a mutable state. So if you press here Ctrl Q, you can see that this is just a mutable state of audio. So it's going to return us an audio. Also, we want to create here another variable. We check here if this is going to be connected. So we can pass in here is connected. And also here we can use our service connection and we can call here is connected. And this one is going to help us to decide if our application is actually connected to the media browser service. Also, we want to provide here to get the root media ID. So we can call this root media ID. And this root media ID here, we want to obtain it after we are just connected. So otherwise here we are just going to get an exception because our media is not connected. So for that case, we are just going to initialize this at a later time. Okay, also we want to get the current playback position. Okay, also here let's create another variable which is going to help us here to update the current position. So we can just create here private var. And for the first time here, we can just set this to true. So we are just going to see how we can use these variables here. Now let's create here the subscription callbacks so that we can easily subscribe to our media browser. So we can just create here a private variable. And here we can just use this object here and we can override this media browser. And here we can override this media browser compact and we can call this subscription callback. And here basically we can override this on child loaded here. So for example here, if you want to get the data, so this is just the thing which we sent here from our media browser. So if you come here, for example, to our media, we come here to our service. So if you navigate here to our onload children here, as you can see here, we sent this result here, this result mutable state of items here. So if you want to use this data here, you can just come to your audio view model. So you have this mutable list of children's here. So you can transform this to what you want to display, for example, or you can send it to the data. So for our case here, we are just going to fetch this data by using our repository. Okay, so for that case here, we can create another variable which is going to help us to get the connection between the media browser and media service. So the last class which we created from the last video. So if you have not seen them, you can find the video in the link in the description box. And also you can find the source code in the link in the description box. Okay, now here we can just provide this service connection here. So we are just going here to implement some logic here to help us to update the playback. So for now, we are just going to leave this empty. So we are just going to update this in a moment. So for now here, we can just create another init block here so that we can just initialize our view model. Okay, now here we can just call the view model scope here and launch. Okay, now here we want to initialize our audio list. So first here we have to create here a private function that is going to help us to get this data. So we can just call this private fun, and here we can just call get and format audio data. And this one is just going to return a list of audio. Okay, so here we want to use the repository here to get our data. So we can just call this repository and get audio data. And also here we want to transform this. Okay, so the first thing here, what we want to do is to get the display name, because here sometimes the display name is going to return until the file extension. So we want to transform this data here and format it for display. So we can just call this val display name. And here we can just get this and we call substring before. And here basically now we can just provide a delimiter. So for our case here it's just this dot here. Okay, also here we want to get the artist. So sometimes this is just going to return an unknown artist and it's just not formatted well. So we are just going to check. So if it, and here basically now we can just pass in, sometimes it's just going to bring you here with this unknown here. So if we get this, we want to return here unknown artist. And otherwise else here we can just return it dot artist. And here basically now we can just copy this data which we have here. And we can just change the display name. And basically here now we can just call artist. And also here we want to pass in the display name. So the display name here, we can just pass in our display name, and also we can pass in here the artist. And we can just format this artist name here. And this we can just create here to be a private suspend function. Okay, so here we can just get and format our audio data. So we can just come here and reinitialize this data here by calling this the audio data. So we can call get audio and format audio data. So here we have loaded our data. Okay, now inside here also we can check if our variable is just connected. So we can just call this is connected, and basically here now we can just collect our data. And here basically now we can check if this is just going to be true. So we can just initialize here several variables. So we can just call here our root media ID. And now here we can use our service connection.get root media ID. So we get our media ID. Also we want to initialize here our current playback position. So we can just get the state. So we can just call this service. Okay, so here we can just update the current playback position, and basically we can just use the position from this data here. So here we have our position where we are just going to be playing, and also we want to subscribe, and here basically now we can just call the service connection. And basically here now we can just pass in the root media ID, and this is just going to be our media ID which we have passed and obtained from our media browser root. And here we can pass in the subscription callback so that we can easily subscribe. So without subscribing here, our media browser is not going to play anything. Okay, so now I think here we have already connected our data. So we can just create now the function that is going to help us to change the player. So for our case here, we can just create a play audio. And here basically we can just pass in the current audio. Okay, so the first thing here, we want to transport the connection here. So we can just call this play audio. And basically now we can just pass in here the list, the audio list. So here is just going to help us to transport the controls and call those custom actions here, because we created this function here, because we're just going to send these custom actions here and call this start media player action here. And we want this to initialize this audio list here so that we can just use it to find the current playing media ID. So for that case here, we have sent those action. Now we want to check if the current audio which we are just playing here, the current audio.id, so if this is just going to be the same as the current playing audio, and here basically now we can find the value. So if this is just the case that we know we are just playing an audio that is already initialized, so what we want to do here is either pause or play the audio. Okay, so here also we want to get the playback state, so we can define here another variable. So for example, here we can just create another private val. And also here we can just call this playback state. And we can call this service connection.playback state here. And also here we want to check if the audio is playing. So this one's just going to return a boolean, and here we can just define a get function here. So we can use this playback state here, and basically here we can get the value, and this could be a nullable value, and we can just check this if is playing here, and basically here we want to make this to be true so that it can be either playing or not. So we can just come back here and see if this, and here we want to check if the audio is actually playing here now. Okay, so if the audio is actually playing, so if this value returns true here, we know that we are playing the audio. So we want to pause the audio, so we can just call this service connection here, and we can call transport control and call pause here. So basically we are just going to pause. Otherwise else here we want to just play this because the audio was paused. So we can call this service connection and transport the control and call play here, and we can just easily play. So for that case here, if this is going to be equal to the value playing here, so we know that there is an audio already initialized and playing. So if this is not the case here, we can just write here another else block here. So we want to transport the control in order to prepare the media. So we can just call the service connection here and call this transport control and play from media ID. And here basically now we want to play from the media ID. And we can just use the current audio. And for that case here also we can just pass in, for extras we can pass in null here. Okay, so here we are just checking if this current audio is going to be playing. So we are knowing that there is an audio already initialized here. So we can just easily pause and play here whenever the value is. And otherwise else here we want to initialize another variable, and we can just pass in here the current audio.id here in order to make the audio to play. Okay, now here we can just create another function that is going to help us to stop the playback. So we can just create here fun and call this stop playback. And here basically now we can just transport our control. So we can call this service connection here and call transport control and call stop. So basically here we're just going to stop our playback. Also, if you want to fast forward, so you can just create here a function and we can just call this fast forward. And basically here we can just call our service connection here, and we can just call fast forward, which we have already implemented. So if you want to increase the variables or the value of time here, because we set the constant to be 10 seconds. And also here we can just create another function, and here we can just call this rewind. And here we can just call this service connection.rewind because we created this variable from the last video. Also, we want here to skip to the next item, so we can just create here a function. And we can just call this skip to next here. Okay, also we want to create another function that is going to help us to seek to another position. So when the user uses that, the seek bar, so that we can just move to other position. So we can call this seek to. And before we use this, we can just come here above and we can create here to get a current duration. And here we can use our media player service. And basically here we can just call this current duration. So we define this from when we are just creating our service here. We define this companion object here and provided this current duration here, which is just going to be the current duration of the playing media ID. So for that case, we are just going to come here to our seek value too. And here we have to pass in a value. So here we can call this value, and this one is going to be of type float because it's going to come from our data. So here we can just call the service connection here, and we can call transport control, and basically we can call seek to. And here basically we want to seek to a certain position. So what we want to do here, we want to get the current duration here, and basically here we can just multiply this by the actual value. And after that, we want to divide this with 100f so that we could have, we can have here a percentage values. So this values is going to be in terms of percentage. So for that case here, we can call this too long. So if this is just going to be 50% here, then we know we are just going to seek until a 57% or other percentage here for our case. That's why we are just dividing this by 100. Okay, now let's create here another function that is going to help us to update the playback and also provide a progress for our progress bar. So here we can just create this to be a private function, and we can just call this update playback. Okay, so we can just call here our view model scope, and we can call launch here. And also we want to create a variable that is going to help us to give a playback state that is going to give us the audio durations or the audio progress. So we can just create here another variable, and we can just call this var. And here basically now we can just create a mutable state of, and we can just pass in here 0f to be our mutable state of 0f. Okay, first thing first, we want to get the position, so we can just call this position. And basically here we can use our playback state here, and we can call .value. And we want to get the current position. And otherwise else here, our current position, we're just going to return 0 here, if this is just going to be null. And for that case here, we can just check if our current position, our current playback position here, if this is just not going to be equal to this position or the current position which we have, and this is just the variable we set it for the first time to be 0. So for this case, if this value is not initialized to this position here, so we can just change the current playback position here, and we can just set it to this position so that we cannot be reinitializing a variable that is just the same. And for that case, we can just check here also if our current duration, so this duration which we have here is just going to be greater than 0 here, then we want to create our current audio progress. And here basically now we want to calculate our audio progress, which can be easily displayed to the audio seek bar. Okay, so we want to initialize this variable to be able to be displayed in a seek bar or in a progress bar, which we're just going to provide here. So here we can just create a, we can just calculate here our current audio progress. So we can just call this current audio playback position here, and we can send this to float. And basically here now we want to divide this with a current duration, which we are going to have the current duration, and we can just also change this to float. And also we want to multiply this by 100%. So here we can just make this 100f here so that we can transform it to a percentage values. Now for that case here, we want to, if we have finished to update here our current progress, what we want to do here, we want to delay this function here to execute. And here basically we can just delay this. We can use the playback interval which we have provided in our constants. And for that case here, we can just call if our update position, if update position, we are just allowed, and we set this value here to be true. And for that case here, we can just call again this update playback updates playback here method. So we want to recall this variable every time after every this. For example, here after every second here we want to update this. So because these values could be changing, and so that we can just reflect it inside our progress bar. So for that case, we are just going to call this, and we are going to stop this value here to be updating when our view model is going to be cleared. So that is just the simple thing which we are going to update our progress. Okay, so we want to also finish up our media browser. So we want to unsubscribe when our view model is going to be disconnected or cleared. So we can just override here the onCleared method. And basically here now we can just call the service connection, and we can call unsubscribe here. And here we want to pass in the root media ID. So we can just call this k.media root ID. And here we want to pass in the subscription callback. So we can just pass in here the media. And we can call this subscription. And basically here we want to pass in this subscription callback, and we don't want to override any type of method here. And for that case here, I think we have finished to unsubscribe, and we want to call this update position here, and we can just set this to false. And for that case here, we cannot now update our variables. So when our view model is just cleared here, so this method here, which we have right here, is not going to execute because we have just stop the position here to be updated, because here we are just been recalling here if this update position here, and for the first time we set this to true. So after that, then we are just going to set this back to false here, so that we cannot execute this method again and again, because we have actually cleared our view model. Okay, now we can just try to rebuild here to see if there is no any error we have here. So guys, our project has finished to build successfully, and we don't have any errors. So let's leave it here for this video. So in the next video, we're just going to finish up to set up our UI using Jetpack Compose. So stay tuned. And if you have not subscribed, please consider subscribing. And if you're finding value out of these videos, please provide a like, and see you in the next video. Bye bye for now.